Is white a color? I think maybe you can consider white a color in some way because it's from a physics light perspective. It really is an addition of all the hues of the visible light. But many actually don't consider white to be a color. It's probably more accurate in the sense that it's part of the shades, just like black. We're gonna talk about white today. Let's go. We're gonna use this sketch of mine as an example. I'll show you where I leave paper white, like in this place here. Leaving paper white has a certain transparency to it, where you can see that you almost can see through it. You know, it's not opaque. There's a certain characteristics of the paper white, as you can see. You can see there are other parts of the sketch where I use opaque white for highlight, such as you know, all the highlights for the beans. As you can see, they are added white, white that's stacked on top of the reds. They are opaque. They give you a sense of a highlight or a kind of a reflected light on the beans. So today we're going to talk about white and how we think about white, how we use white, what are the pigments that you can use to make transparent or opaque whites, and you know, basically all things white. So I'm going to give you examples. I'm going to talk through some of my thinking in the sense of how I sketched. Okay, if you're interested in how I sketched this chendol, which is a sort of a dessert in this part of the world, I'll put a link up here for you to check it out. Before we talk about other parts of white, I want to talk about the paper itself. If you're gonna leave paper white, so you know, paper has in some ways affect the outcome of your sketch. Manufacturers have different sort of tint. Even though they are white, they could be different tint. So in this case, Fabriano makes this traditional white, which is slightly colored milkish white, if you like. It's not pure white. There's no such thing as pure white. And of course, they make this other one, which is extra white. Well, extra white, of course, as the name suggests, is that the paper itself has less tint. It's closer to probably what optically you will see as white. Of course, it's a matter of preference. The most important thing you need to remember is that white is a relative color. It is not absolute, it's relative. You see white when there are other colors around, and it makes you feel the presence of this lack of hues, which is really white. Another thing to note is that every manufacturer will have a slightly different tint. So, you know, if you buy Winston & Newton or you buy any of the other brands, you will find that the tinting and the whiteness differs, and this is something you have to keep in mind. Okay, I'm going to quote my favorite art teacher of all time, Edgar Whitney. He talks about this idea that you have to think pattern first, then drawing, then color, right? In that order of priority. The character of your painting is resolved in the pattern scheme. When you look at the example I show you, the dessert I painted, there was a clear idea around the design. In this case, I have, well, something like a fallen F. Well, the F has fallen on the side, and the rest of the stuff that you see that doesn't make the F are like embellishment, if you like. I have a video on this specific topic on key strategies on leaving white, basically leaving your paper white with design concept in place so that you can have your white more effectively left on, well, as in like you leave it alone. I'll put a link here for you if you're interested in this video. Okay, I'm going to use this photograph. It's a beautiful photograph to talk about how I would sketch this photo, for example, where I would consider using left white. In other words, I'll leave the paper white, and where I would consider putting on opaque highlights of white. I'll talk about the different colors you use later as well, the titanium and zinc oxide white later on, because I do need to give you some information around the different pigments you need to create these sort of effects. Okay, so this part where I've highlighted with a pink highlighter, you will see that I'm suggesting when you are sketching something like this, a big blob of white, I would use paper white, and what I'll do is I'll go over with grays to sculpt the three-dimension body shape. But the small thin line of white is very hard to leave white. Although you can try, but I would say that I would suggest more likely than not that you would just paint over the whole thing, and you know, you would use what I call opaque white to give you the thin lines or thin white. So you'll find me suggesting where I put in the pink highlighter. You will see that that is where I suggest you use opaque white. In other words, painted white and not paper white, as in left you know, white without painting anything over. And the reason for that is because it's easier to paint thin lines of white with white paper or white colors with very thin brush, or you know, you can make marks with you know, either you scrape it with the end of your brush, or you use something very thin to scrape the whites on the dark shape, assuming you paint over the background black or dark, and then you use white opaque to kind of put you know, the thin line on the paper. Okay, I'm going to switch topic to talk about white versus gray when you do highlights. And I'm going to use this little fellow here, Max. I painted him in remembrance of his passing. He's owned by a friend of mine, and who commissioned me to paint Max. But what I want to talk about is the fur here are not all ghastly pure white. Let me zoom into the fur itself. You see that there are some whites and there are some gray fur that I have thrown in. Look at the eye, there are some grayish fur, and on top of that I've kind of layered the little bit more whitish fur, if you like. That's what I meant by gray versus white for highlights. So not all fur or highlights should be completely white, if you like. Think of it as understanding the gray tones and looking at accurately at your subject. You know, observe carefully. You will find that some are very white, some are in fact gray. There's a lot more detail in the video. I'll put a link up here to this video that I made earlier this year. Okay, let's use another photograph and show you where I would consider using pure white, opaque white for the highlights, and maybe where I would consider using a colored version or tinted version of white for the other sort of highlights. If you look carefully, this photograph on the left part of the hair, they are a little bit more whitish. So this is where I would put more whitish opaque, if you like. Whereas if you look at the left hand side, you would see, or left part of the hair, you see that they are a little bit more tinted, or maybe even grayish or more brownish. So this is what I meant by observing carefully between the left and the right, and you know, one where you might use pure white or even slightly tinted, but the other part where you will actually have it more heavily tinted, and that is to represent shadow and light to a large extent by what you observe. Okay, now I want to talk about how white is not white, but your eye sees white, but actually when you paint them, it cannot be pure white. It doesn't work that way. It's because white is relative. If we zoom in to look at part of the plate, you will see that what our eyes see as a white plate consists of reflected white. There's a slight tinge of yellow because it's reflected from the desert, and there are also grays or shadows. In fact, if you look carefully at the shadow, they are even brownish. In fact, the shadow at the bottom part is a little bit bluish, and there's even a tinge of yellow and a tinge of green. I'm not sure whether you can see it, but if you look carefully by observation, you'll find that it is an explosion or a myriad of colors in it, and therefore actually you have every right to throw in those colors when you're painting these sort of white. And then you look at the right hand side where the flowers, you look closely at the petal, you will even find hues of green and yellow in it, and that's how you can create 3 dimension of white flowers. Okay, here's another example of a so-called white car, and what you will see here is all kinds of reflection and all kinds of hues reflected from the white. One thing about white is that it's highly reflective. Well, even other colors are reflective, but white is especially so, and you will find all kinds of colors in it. Let's zoom in to look at the right side of the car, where you can see all kinds of reflection. So you see here all kinds of reflections. There is a blown out highlight, probably from light source. There's also blue, reflective, and red especially. I think there's a lot of red light source around nearby, and you see all the reflected light, sort of bounce off the white surface of the car. So this is something that you have to keep in mind when you're sketching anything white, that ultimately you have to find the reflection and you got to represent it in your sketch. Okay, so the first pigment I want to talk about is Chinese white, or zinc oxide, and before that, let's look at what the notation means. The first one is light fastness. That means how light fast or how lasting the color is. You want it to be 1 or excellent, which means it will last more than 100+ years. The second one is staining. It has a rating of 1, 2, 3, 4. Granulation, yes or no. Transparency with the graphics of wholly white, halfway, and wholly black, the whole circle. So coming back to Chinese white, it is very light fast. It is non-staining, 1, non-granulating, and it's somewhat opaque, or somewhat in the middle of I'll guess not transparent and not opaque. And here's the thing, we know Chinese white is the more transparent white. It is not completely transparent, because white inherently will have to be somewhat opaque, but the idea here is that Chinese white is the more transparent of the two whites. Okay, titanium white is the more opaque version of the white. It has exactly the same ratings. It's made of PW6, which is titanium, the pigments, and so in some ways what I'm saying is that the rating itself doesn't really tell you, but from experience, zinc oxide or Chinese white is used in the form of more transparent, and titanium white is used in the form of more opaque. Okay, I'll tell you 2 other opaque white that I use extensively. This one is the Uniball white gel marker from Mitsubishi, and this one, the Copic opaque white. You can use a brush or a liner to kind of paint your white. They are very opaque. So either one of those would work. I much prefer the Copic opaque. It looks a little bit more like color. Okay, so those are the pigments I use for my whites and highlights painted white. Okay, enough of theory, and let me talk about how you could paint white. I'm going to use this sketch as an example. You see that it is a white teapot, and the way I painted white was to not paint the teapot, but to paint surrounding the teapot with red. And the shadows, and use purples to create a 3-dimensional kettle and teacup, right? If you're interested in this video, I put a link this here for you. Well, one thing is to paint the thing white, but another one is to sculpt a 3-dimensional sense of the object that you're sketching. Okay, the object, the Lion's Guardian statue is not quite white, it's kind of gray, but the idea is the same. I paint around it, but I also used shadows to create a 3-dimensional sense of the sculpture. Okay, one last point in this video I want to make about the color white. And that is, white against a very dark or black background is the best contrast, and therefore it is the best eye-catching focused technique you can put on in your sketch. Anything that puts white against black or very, very light against very, very dark gives you contrast, and that is the best way and the best mechanic you can use to really create that oomph, or that that zest for your sketch. Try it. If you have soft contrast in the past, if you use strong contrast like this, it always catch your attention of your audience. Okay, so that's it for this week. It's been a a little bit too long. In fact, I think 15 minutes is the video. I really didn't intend to make it so long, but I did have to cram all the basic 101 content on white that I know of for you beginners sketchers. I hope this helps. And I have a request. If you have seen this video up to this point, thank you for your loyal tuning in. I have a request. Drop a note below and tell me how I'm doing with the video, because I've been tremendously busy with work and it's been quite horrible in terms of time and so on. So I really didn't have much time to do the video as I would like, but I still try to hammer out these sketches, sketching videos for you. I appreciate some feedback in the form of what you like, what you don't like about it, and just give me feedback. Anything, it's it's appreciated. So with that, thank you very much. Stay safe wherever you are and take care. Bye.